So we'll start off the day of this being the virtual corn and college and soybean school with the Battle of the Belt. And so we'll turn it over here to Laura Lindsay, Osler Ortez, and Taylor Dill to kind of talk about this study and what we have learned so far.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Welcome, everyone, to the Virtual Corn College Soybean School. I'm happy to kick it off with Battle for the Belt. Hopefully, you guys have heard about this project already. But I'm Laura Lindsay. I'm the soybean and small grain agronomist. We also have Dr. Osler Ortez. He is my counterpart on the other side, the corn side. And then Taylor Dill, who is a PhD student working with both of us. And I'll thank you guys in advance for taking Taylor's survey. This is really important to help us fine-tune our research and extension efforts. So thank you very much. So let me share my screen real quick. All right, you guys should be able to see it. Awesome. So Battle for the Belt is really a project, collaborative project to really address a very common question. What crop should be planted first, corn or soybean? So it's very common knowledge. Earlier soybean planting dates help maximize yield. The same is true for corn. So when I talk to farmers, I say plant your soybeans early. Osler, he'll come right after me and give a presentation. And what does Osler say?
Plant corn first.
Plant corn first. And then we have a farmer in the audience. And what does that farmer say? Well, what do I do? So this research is really to answer some of those questions. And to kick it off, we have a video. All right, so what is Battle for the Belt? I already explained it's really what crop should we plant first, corn or soybean? But also we can look at the other side, which crop has the smallest penalty for delayed planting? Can we adjust our management practices to mitigate losses due to late planting? Of course, we don't want to plant late, but weather conditions in Ohio sometimes dictate when we plant, and it's later than what we'd like to see. And then we're working with other specialists to look at interactions with insects, diseases, weeds, and many other factors. So when you alter your planting date, you also alter what problems you may encounter throughout the growing season. So we know that both planting date for corn and soybean is extremely important. In corn, we've seen as much as 1.75 bushels per acre per day loss if you plant after the end of April. In soybeans, we've measured about a half bushel per acre per day if you plant after the end of April. And these are based on models. Some years it may be more, some years it may be less losses, but on average, this is what we tend to see. Ohio is very challenging. The planting window is extremely small. I think both of these pictures were taken last year, although it could be probably any year in Ohio. It's wet in the spring. And so our planting window is really small, and that's forcing farmers to plant maybe a little bit earlier or a little bit later than what they would like. And unfortunately, this planting window is getting smaller. So Kansas State University has a really nice website where they look at workable field days. And in Ohio, we're seeing fewer days each spring to do field work. So between April 17th and May 15th in Ohio, there's an average of 15 suitable field work days. And this isn't only planting, this is field work days for any tillage, fertilizer application, spraying, anything you need to do. So that's a really short window of time. That's really should be your best planting dates. So again, farmers are forced to plant earlier or later than what is ideal. So planting date is really key to optimizing yield. So this research is really going to help us address which one is okay, maybe to plant a little bit earlier, a little bit later, and what crop do you need to plant really in that sweet spot? So I'm going to turn it over to Osler to talk a little bit about our project.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome everyone to the program today. We are getting ourselves started with setting up the foundation of what is the project about, what were the research locations, what were the treatments. That's part of what I am going to introduce here in the next few slides. This project was started in 2023, last year, so we have a full field season so far that Taylor has been actively working for. We are looking into continuing this work into 2024, 2025. We know that results from 2023 can be different to what we might be able to see in 2024, just depending on the year, depending on Mother Nature. The list of targeted planting dates is the focus of this work. The research has been done in 3 different locations. We have Northeast Ohio in our Worcester Research Farm. We have Western Ohio at the Western Research Station, and we have Northwest Ohio at the Northwest Research Station. Those are the 3 research sites, and we have been looking at 5 planting windows. Those are listed on the screen. We have an ultra early treatment targeting late March to early April. We have an early treatment targeting mid to late April planting date. We have a normal planting time frame, which is early to mid-May. That's the typical recommendation for achieving optimum yields in both crops. There is also a late treatment looking from late May to early June, and we have a very late treatment from mid to late June. It's important to keep in mind as we try to push those envelopes to the very early side or to the very late, it's important to keep in mind crop insurance recommendations, crop insurance deadlines as far as the earliest planting date for a corn or soybean crop, or also even considering on the back end the latest planting date for corn and soybean, if you are looking into being compliant to crop insurance options. So these 2 figures here on the screen, these 2 maps, they are showing what the earliest planting date deadlines are for corn on the left, and the same for soybeans on the right. What we can see there is that Southern Ohio on the green of the map for corn, in Southern Ohio, we can plant corn as early as April 5th. And then Central and Northern Ohio, we can plant corn as early as April 10th. Similar story for soybeans. In the South, we have as early as April 5th, and in the North, as early as April 15th. Those are the deadlines that we need to keep in mind. Besides planting dates, initially that was the baseline of this research question that we are trying to address. But as the opportunity came together, we ended up also considering 2 other factors, one for corn and one for soybeans. So on top of the 5 planting dates, we are also doing hybrid relative maturity work for corn. We have 4 different hybrids. We have 100-day relative maturity, 107, 111, and 115. Now, this factor in the experiment comes as part of our Ohio State University agronomy guide recommendations. If we are planting later in the year, there might be a consideration warranted for adjusting relative maturities. If we are planting in June, it probably makes more sense to plant a shorter maturity. And if we are planting early, April or May, it probably makes more sense, a longer relative maturity. That's the factor for corn. Now, moving into soybeans, relative in terms of varieties and maturity groups, that's usually a standard recommendation for the state. However, when we look at the current agronomic recommendations for soybeans, as far as delaying planting date in the year, we see the recommendation on potentially adjusting your seeding rates. Usually later planting dates recommend coming up with a higher seeding rate, and we wanted to test that as part of this experiment. I will turn it over to Laura. She will walk us through some of the results that we saw on that first year on soybeans.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to talk about the soybean side first, as of course the better crop, Osler. So our three locations again, Northwest Ohio, that was in Wood County, West Central, which is in Clark County, and then Northeast Ohio in Wayne County. So as Osler mentioned, we had our main plot, our main effect was planting date, those 5 planting dates going from April into mid-June. But we also had a seeding rate factor to see if we need to adjust our seeding rate based on when we plant. So our first 2 locations mentioned here on the slides, Northwest and then Western, there was a planting date effect, but no seeding rate effect. So whether we planted 100,000 seeds per acre or 210,000 seeds per acre, soybean yield was statistically the same. So what that tells me, when we plant early, plant your normal seeding rate. If that's 140, 150, around that range is fine. You may be able to get away with planting 100,000 seeds per acre. But there's inherent risk of going too low, even though our research didn't show that. That's not what I would recommend, but your normal target seeding rate should be fine if you plant soybeans really early. The location that was a little bit different was Northeast Ohio. So this is the Worcester location where we did see a planting date by seeding rate interaction. So that means based on your planting date, you're going to want to adjust your seeding rate. And I'll show more of those results in a minute. So I'm going to first talk about the Northwest and Western location first and together, since those 2 locations were fairly similar. So what you're looking at here with this graph in blue is our Northwest location, orange is a Western location. Our vertical axis is soybean yield. And then on our horizontal axis is days planted after April 1st. So these are our planting dates, just so you can see them. The 2 locations almost had identical planting dates, which is very hard to achieve in research. So that's great. So our first planting dates were that middle of April, and then 2 weeks later, the end of April, 2 weeks later in middle of May, end of May, and then going to June 8th. So Northwest Ohio, our first 2 planting dates, again, were that mid-April and end of April. Yields were statistically the same at 84, 85 bushels per acre. So very good yields. When we planted May 11th, a slight decline in yield. So about a loss of 3 to 4 bushels per acre. And then our 4th planting date, end of May, 78 bushels per acre. And then June 8th was 71 bushels per acre. Of course, 71 bushels is not as good as 85, but I thought it was still very remarkable that June 8th yielded 71 bushels. We don't want to go with June 8th, but I know some years it happens. 2019 sticks out in my mind, where people were, especially in Northwest Ohio, forced to plant into June because of the wet weather. But yields can be maintained, at least it was in this year. In terms of our plant stand, just so you have an idea, we did have those seeding rate treatments, so this is just the averages, but the average plant population across those planting dates were all over 100,000 seeds per acre. So we had a decent plant population across those planting dates. Our other location, West Central Ohio, again, this is Clark County. Our first 3 planting dates here yielded statistically the same, going from 91 bushels per acre for our first planting date, 87 bushels per acre on our second planting date, and 88 on our third, which is May 11th. But what's interesting here is you have a fairly large drop-off in yield going from May 11th to the end of May. That's a loss of 18 bushels per acre, which is quite significant. So our end of May and into June, 70 and 69 bushels per acre there. In terms of plant stand, all of them were over 100,000 plants per acre, except for our first planting date. That one was a tick lower, averaging 94,000 plants per acre. So 2023, I say this every year, 2023 was a weird year. Every year is weird though in Ohio. So this is a picture from our western location, and I'm going to turn it over to Taylor to talk about this. And she was our boots on the ground graduate student for this project. Taylor?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Laura said, I was there at every location every week, basically from the start of planting. So I got to experience the whole season here. And this is particularly at the western location. And you can see our first planting date here on May 3rd. It was very wet and very cold. I believe Laura took this picture and she said it was kind of spitting snow that day. And so you can see what our first planting date went through, and that it also topped out our yield at this location. So I find our soybean resiliency very impressive. And then if we look at the picture on the right here, we see that within our early planting dates, weed competition can be an issue, because while these soybeans really obviously struggled to get to this unifoliate stage, this ragweed is unfazed by any of this weather. So you can see some of the complications that we can have in these earlier planting dates as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was an extremely cold day there on May 3rd. And really, we had cold weather persisting into June. We had a wheat field day in the middle of June, and I wore a sweater the whole day. So really, those cool temperatures went quite a ways.
Absolutely.
So whenever you planted this year, it was rough. So if you hit those early planting dates in April, it was wet and it was cold. I couldn't walk in the field because my boots were so muddy. Looking more at the normal planting dates though, so we hit some dry weather. So Taylor, you want to talk a little bit about the dry weather we saw?
For sure. So we see this photo, that's from June 7th, and that's a good 3 weeks into our dry weather this year. We really didn't have any rain of any significance at the western location during that time period. And we see planting date 1 on the left completely okay during this weather, and 3 days after this was when our drought broke. So we had some pretty heavy storms on June 10th, and then for the next 2 weeks we were kind of wet. But we see planting date 3, which was again significantly or statistically similar to planting date 1, struggling to emerge out of how dry it was. But whether it was really wet and cold or dry, actually it was fairly dry and cold. Like Laura said, we sustained cooler temperatures through June. The soybeans were really resilient. But I would also like to mention, this is 1 day before planting date 5 went in, and I think a week and a half after planting date 4 went in when we see that drop off. So planting date 4 and 5 both went into the ground very, very dry. And I think we can see why moisture at planting can be really, really important. When planting day 3 was planted, it had a few weeks of wetter weather behind it, while your planting day 4 and 5 didn't. And I think that is a really important point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And our first 3 planting dates yielded the same. So the wet ones, and then the ones that were planted in the dry, the ones that were planted into really, really dry, that's where we see that steep decline in yield. So I'm going to talk about Northeast Ohio separately because this is the location where there was a planting date by seeding rate interaction. So this graph is set up a little bit differently. On the vertical axis, you're looking at soybean yield in bushels per acre. And then in the horizontal axis is our seeding rates. So our seeding rates again started at 100,000 seeds per acre and went to 210,000 seeds per acre. And then the different colored dots are our yields. So our first planting date was April 14th. It's my wedding anniversary, but it was not necessarily a good day to plant soybeans in Worcester. Our yields were the lowest for that first planting date on April 14th. Going to our next planting date, which is April 27th, yields were a little bit higher. So these are the orange dots in the middle. So middle of the road in terms of yield. But our highest yielding soybeans were at that May 11th planting date. Those are the gray dots at the top. And here you're looking at somewhere between 50 and 60 bushels per acre as our highest. May 30th, a couple of weeks later. In yellow, those were fairly high, not as high as our May 11th, but the second highest yielding. And then June 21st, the lighter blue color, more in the middle towards a lower yield. So I mentioned there was a seeding rate interaction. So what we saw with our first two planting dates, we needed a lot of seed, a lot. So looking here at April 14th, we see soybean yield increase pretty dramatically as we increased our seeding rate. And you can also see that on April 27th. But for our more normal planting dates, May 11th through June 21st, there was no effective seeding rate. So regardless of what we seeded, yields were statistically the same. So why did we need so much seed? Well, our plant populations were really, really low. So Taylor did these stand counts, and she called me from the field and said, "Hey, Laura, I have 29,000 plants per acre." And I was like, "That's great, Taylor." And then she said, "Well, no, that's for soybean, not corn." So if you can't tell the difference between your soybean plant population and your corn plant population, you have a problem. So we needed 210,000 seeds per acre to get 34,000. So there were not a lot of plants for that early planting date. What's interesting though, 34,000 plants per acre is very low. This is a situation where people would replant their soybeans for sure, but it still yielded about 45 bushels per acre. Not great. Our highest yields are more in the 60s, but for 34,000 plants per acre, I think that's a very decent yield. Taylor commented these plants look like little trees, maybe. They're really able to branch out and compensate for those low stands. Our second planting date, April 27th, also had a low plant population, not quite as low, but we were down to that 22,000 plants per acre, up to 50,000 plants per acre. So you can again see where those higher seeding rates were important. But moving on to our more normal planting dates, we were able to have better plant populations on May 11th. It's still interesting though, when you're planting 100,000 seeds per acre, we got 68,000 plants per acre. Statistically, yields were the same. So I get a lot of questions about when we should replant soybeans, but that threshold we think is about 50,000 plants per acre. And I think this data would help support that. Even though we had 68,000 plants per acre, yields were the same as if we had over 100,000 plants per acre. Looking at our other planting dates, our stands were good. What's interesting to me is going out to either May 30th or June 21st, even though our stands were higher, our yields were lower. And so I was mentioning to people that I think planting date is more important than having maybe a perfect stand of 120,000 plants per acre. Granted, if you go too low, below that 50,000, there's problems. But if you're somewhere between that 75 to 100,000 plants per acre with a good planting date, those soybean plants can really compensate and maximize yield. So why the low stands, Taylor?
So there was a lot of interesting things that happened at the Worcester location that I think contribute to our low stand. And if you look at this picture here on the right, we see seed corn maggot. And this picture was taken on May 5th. Osler and I were out actually digging up seeds because we couldn't find anything that had emerged from our April 14th planting date. And we were really hoping to find out why. And we dug up a few seeds, and they were just covered in seed corn maggot. And I believe the next week, Kelly Tillman published a corn newsletter talking about seed corn maggot, and our insecticides that we normally put on the seed are generally very good at taking care of this problem. However, they're water soluble. So these sat in really wet ground for about 3 weeks, and we think that some of that insecticide possibly leached off the seed, so it was no longer protected. Compounding with the fact we think there was an increased amount of disease pressure at this location, we took seedlings from each planting date to evaluate seedling diseases that we're still going through that data as well, but we think we have an interaction between insect disease and obviously how cold and wet it was. So the environment, possibly seed corn maggot, and disease as the trifecta that made our stand so low.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get a lot of questions in the spring about why plant populations are low, and they ask me if it was disease or was it insects or was it the weather, and I just slugs. I usually just say yes. Usually when we see low plant populations, it's a compilation of problems, but we're really happy to work with plant pathology and entomology to help pin down maybe some reasons why these populations are so low. So just in general of what we've seen for soybean in Northwest and Western Ohio, it was fine to plant as soon as that crop insurance date allows. If your soil moisture conditions are adequate, you don't want to mud in your crops certainly, but we had good conditions and it was fine. So in Northwest Ohio, again, as a reminder that early planting date for crop insurance is April 15th. In Western Ohio was April 10th. And then in terms of seeding rate, there wasn't much effect. You may be able to go low, 100,000 seeds per acre. It's risky, but not huge changes you need to make to your seeding rate based on your planting date when you're planting early. Northeast Ohio, even though it has the same crop insurance date as Northwest Ohio, that one you might want to be a little bit more cautious on. Of course, this is 1 year of data from this study, but we have 2 years of data prior to this study where we looked at really planting dates in Northeast Ohio. One of the years we planted the first week of April and it was fine. Another year we had very low plant populations and lower yields. So I would be a little bit maybe more cautious up in that portion of the state. It just tends to be a little bit cooler than our other locations. In terms of our soybean development, so Taylor was out weekly looking at these plots, so she was able to take growth stage measurements on a weekly basis at all 3 locations. So for me, it was very interesting to look at, and this is just looking in general across our 3 locations based on planting dates. And what I observed is when we plant early, we tend to have a longer vegetative stage. So there's more plant growth, more nodes where pod can go. And your R1, R2, your flowering stages are shifted later as you plant later, which makes sense. R3 and R4 are really about the same length of time, regardless of when you plant, just shifted later. But then R5 and R6 tends to be elongated. Those growth stages are elongated when you plant earlier. And R5 to R6 is really that critical time for soybean in terms of maximizing yield. So if you have a longer grain fill period with adequate moisture, that's where we could really see some of those yields maximized. So I'm gonna turn it over to Osler to talk about the corn side, the other side, the dark side. Is that right, Osler?
I think that based on the crop insurance maps, corn can be planted a little bit earlier in Northern Ohio, so there might be an advantage there. I live in Worcester. That's where my office is, Worcester campus, Worcester, Ohio. I have nothing to do with the low plant stance on soybeans at that location. It's just the crop. We blame it.
Sure. We have cameras out there, Osler, so I'm gonna review them.
We will be seeing some camera results later this morning from Luke, PhD student on FAB department. So let's touch base about corn results 1 year. A little bit of different dynamics as compared to what Laura discussed on soybeans. The same 3 research locations. I don't think we have mentioned that these plots, corn and soybeans, were planted on the same day and almost on the same field, side by side. All corn and all soybean planted at the same calendar date, and just as close as possible to each other. Hopefully very similar or comparable soil conditions. All of those were constant. And as far as crop management, both corn and soybeans, they did receive standard recommendations, applications. So that's how things were managed. We only wanted planting date, seeding rate, and hybrid being the factors varying with variation in the trial. The results that we are seeing from year one on corn, basically we are seeing an interaction. We are seeing an interaction. There is a planting date effect that is also affected depending on the hybrid. So that's where the interaction comes. That means, and we will be seeing some of the results here in the next couple of slides. That means that for a given planting date, we will be looking at different hybrid relative maturities as far as optimizing that corn yield. Let's go ahead and get started with Northwest Ohio. What we see in this figure is planting date on the horizontal line, and we have corn yield in the vertical axis. The blue line in the figure represents our shorter maturity hybrid, 100-day. The orange line represents a 107-day hybrid. Our gray line represents a 111-day, and our yellow line, 115-day. What we can see from the general trend here is that in order to maximize yield at this particular location, Northwest Ohio, that is Wood County, we are seeing best results using that full maturity material, 115-day, and not too far from the 111 as well. So longer relative maturities ended up performing well in Northwest Ohio as long as we planted early. The other thing to notice here is that planting day 1, 2, and 3 yielded about the same in the 250, close to 250 bushels to the acre. After May 11, we see that sharp decline in corn yields. So that little table is basically giving us some of the recommendations as far as, depending on the planting date, what was the best hybrid maturity that we were able to manage. And just a point, a note here on the 100-day hybrid. You see very, very low yields rise since the beginning on that blue line. However, if we went to the last planting date on June 8th, that 100-day hybrid ended up yielding better than the other materials. We are now constrained in a much shorter season. And back to the initial comments I had on the current recommendations, if we are planting later or late in the year, we might want to consider adjusting those relative maturities in corn, and this is precisely why. We don't want to go early with a short maturity, but late, we might want to do it. So let's shift to the next location, Northeast Ohio, that is Wayne County, that's Worcester. We have dates, planting dates on the horizontal line, and we have corn yields in the vertical line. Yields anywhere from 150 to 250 bushels per acre. We have also the same lines and colors depending on the hybrids. What we can see in this second location is that the best planting date was that May 11. May 11 using the 107-day hybrid or the 115-day hybrid gave us the best agronomic yielding results. If we planted early, we saw lower yields. If we planted later, we saw lower yields as expected. So this location right there is giving us a different dynamic to what we saw in Northwest Ohio, in terms that Northwest Ohio did have a benefit of planting corn very early. That means corn winning. Now in Northeast Ohio, not necessarily. And we already heard that the northeast location had very unique challenges, wet and cold, and perhaps planting a little later than desired. But again, in this second location, we are seeing that decline on corn yields that we have been discussing since the beginning, and that's why we are usually trying to push both crops as early as possible so that we don't see that decline after the first half of May. This is our last location, a little bit more challenging. What we are seeing here is that corn is losing. If you plant corn in the first 3 days at the west central location, this is Clark County, we see that that's actually when corn yielded the lowest. Regardless of the hybrid, there are dynamics going on, but we wanted to avoid those 3 planting dates in order to achieve our better results. And the better results at this location, West Central, was on May 25th. That's actually later than what we typically recommend. But again, unique environmental conditions last year really influenced what we are seeing here, these results that we are seeing here. So this whole figure here is challenging the conception that earliest planting will give us better yields. That's not the case. That's not happening for this 1 year, 1 site condition. As far as relative maturities, 107 day on May 25th gave us the highest yield, almost 275 bushels to the acre. That's pretty good, and that's already May 25th, end of May. And Taylor will help us discuss a little bit more of field observations for this location as far as corn, as they relate to corn. But we had a very harsh condition on getting this crop off the ground early in the season, and also water availability. There was that dry spell from the middle of May almost through the middle of June. That was a very dry period that didn't help the first 3 planting dates. Now, if we go to the later planting dates, we had good precipitation conditions, almost 3 inches of water available shortly after planting. So that helped pushing those yields for the planting date 4 and planting date 5 at this site. Taylor, we'll hand it over to you, some of your field observations of your weekly visits at this location.
Absolutely. So corn had to go through the exact same thing the soybeans did, but had a very different reaction to it. So what we're looking at here is planting date 1 corn, actually. I took these pictures, so I kind of know what plots we're looking at. And we ended up having floppy or rootless corn. And this was really apparent throughout the whole month of June. So we had, I was looking back at my notes, and it was floppy for at least 3 weeks. And usually if you have this problem, it's between like V3 and V8, and it'll eventually grow out of it, which it did. But what happens is if you plant if you plant and it's really wet afterwards, the roots struggle to develop the nodal roots around the crown. So those help with stability, but they also help with water and mineral uptake. And then once you get a storm, it can become very apparent that you have a lack of stability from a lack of those roots. And we did see that happen in those early planting dates. And for partially some of the reason why that planting date 3 had so many issues is that dry period that happened just after planting. The corn really needs that water after planting, and it just shut off right after we put that corn in the ground. So that's part of the reason why we see such an anomaly for planting date 3.
So basically, this is fair game. Soybean had challenges, corn had challenges. We are trying to see which of the 2 can still perform better. This is in this slide, we have a summary of the results from that first year of research. Certainly, we want to conduct 2 or 3 more years, complete 3 years in order to have a better characterization of years and conditions, precipitation, temperatures. But based on the first year results, this is what we are seeing. In Northwest Ohio, that's Wood County, best if planted as soon as possible. That was April or May, using a full season hybrid, 115-day. Yield losses clearly after May 11, just as we have understood before. Northeast Ohio, Wayne County, best if planted on May 11th, meaning going early was not necessarily a great idea. And that May 11th planting gave us the best yields, either with 107-day or 115-day relative maturity corn. In West Central Ohio, that was the location that we just discussed with those anomalies. Certainly, we saw that there was a benefit to planting later in the year due to first wet and then very dry conditions. May 25th ended up yielding best using the 107-day relative maturity hybrid for corn. A few observations on phenological development from this past year, using similar notes and information that Taylor was collecting on a weekly basis at all these 3 locations. Some of the notes that or observations include that we had wet conditions, we also had cold conditions, and we also had dry spells. So all over the board, right? That's what we are seeing from that first year. We did notice there was a slow progress in stages and growth of the crop for corn. All 3 sites were roughly only putting 1 leaf per week. That's considered slow. Typically, we would like to see a couple of leaves in a week, depending on temperatures. There is usually from emergence to B10 stage, we see that there is a need for about 82 growing degree day units are needed for each leaf. And then from B10 stage up to the last leaf or tasseling, we had a small typo here. That should be 50. 50 growing degree days are needed for each leaf from B10 to tasseling. So in general, this last year, as it relates to corn, we had lower temperatures that was conducive to fewer growing degree day units. Those are related to heat units. Those are driven by temperatures in every day. And also that was conducive to a delayed corn harvest that we all heard about on the last season. Those 2 figures here are showing the 10-year average on the orange line for growing degree day accumulation in one of the Ohio sites. And the blue line is showing the growing degree day accumulation for corn on the blue line. We see that departure, we were below average. And when we look at corn harvest in the bottom right side of the slide, we see corn harvest progress was certainly behind on the orange line for 2023 compared to 2022 or the 5-year average. So we saw corn was pushed behind through all the season, and that was likely affected by all this variation and lower temperatures. Laura will share some summary slides, and hopefully she doesn't put a preference to soybeans. We will see.
I already heard Osler say, did you say corn lost? I know it was Western, but you didn't say that on the recording, so I can just maybe auto-tune that for the next meeting. But I'm going to talk about corn versus soybean. So what you're looking at here, this is Northwest Ohio. Corn yield is on the left side axis, left axis, and soybean is on the other side. There's different ways we can look at this. I've looked at it by relative yield as a percentage, but this is just showing straight yield. But our top corn yields tended to be about 250 bushels per acre, and our top soybean yields were about 100 bushels per acre. So that is 100% yield, if that makes sense. And then you saw for corn, there was also a planting date by hybrid interaction. For this graph, I took the best hybrid, so I wasn't taking that hybrid into account. So for the earlier dates, that might be a longer hybrid, and for the later planting dates, it could be an earlier. So I did adjust for that. Blue line here is corn. Corn yields were maximized at that May 11th planting date, but still very high yields for April planting dates as well. For soybean, our highest yields were technically the second planting date, but statistically the first and second were the same. What's really interesting when you're comparing corn and soybean here at the Northwest location, both crops benefited from earlier planting dates for sure. But what you see the big difference is for corn is that yield declines very sharply. So once you hit May 11th, that yield declines rapidly. Where soybean, yes, the highest yields were those April planting dates. But if you're delayed, the penalty wasn't quite as high. So you're seeing a more gradual loss in yield as you go into June. Northeast Ohio, these lines are almost parallel in a way, very similar trends. Corn and soybean both suffered from early planting in that Northeast location in Worcester. For soybean, that was for sure plant population related. For corn, it was probably just that stressful conditions. I know this location laid a little bit wetter, maybe than our other locations, and had cooler temperatures. Corn and soybean yield were both maximized for that same planting date. May 11th was ideal. But similar to Northwest Ohio, once you hit May 11th, that corn yield sharply declines compared to soybean, which is more of a gradual slope. And I think this makes sense. This is why we have double crop soybeans after wheat in Ohio, but not double crop corn, because soybean can get away with later planting. It's not ideal, but you can get away with it.
So Laura,
Go ahead.
quick comment. So I am hearing that corn might have a little bit of an advantage at the western and northwest.
I didn't say that.
Well, there is a drastic decline later, so we want to be proactive with that.
That is correct.
If we know that beforehand.
Yes, yeah, corn had that sharper decline, and I'm just teasing. I think corn probably does have a slight advantage. I'll say slight advantage to maybe earlier planting at those locations compared to soybean, because soybean had a decline in yield, but just much more gradual than what you would see for corn. Corn, once you hit that May 11th, it really fell off a cliff. So this one's my favorite, West Central Ohio. So this is not necessarily what we would expect. It's an odd year, but odd years happen. Generally, corn will yield better if you plant earlier, but just the stressful conditions that lined up perfectly at West Central really put corn at a disadvantage compared to soybean. Soybean is a really pretty resilient crop when it's planted early. It can withstand colder temperatures, wetter temperatures, where corn can't maybe navigate that quite as well. So these stressful conditions really, I think, set soybean up for success if you're comparing it to corn. But again, this is not necessarily something that's going to happen every year, and certainly Osler is not going to tell people to plant corn in June in Western Ohio, but it can happen. Weird things happen in agronomy. For soybeans, even though those crops had the same stressful conditions, soybeans didn't care whether they were planted in early or mid-April into middle of May. Yields were the same. Corn, though, was opposite. What you would think would be the best planting date of May 11th, it was the worst, and corn yields were higher as you planted later. But Taylor already discussed some of the stressful issues there related to corn. So some interesting observations from Western Ohio. So I'll turn it over to Osler to talk about some of our concluding remarks of corn versus soybean.
Thank you, Laura. I take the loss on at the western location for 2023. That's fine. Soybean yields in general, this is general comments, conclusions from this first year experience. Soybean yields were more stable, as Laura just showed us, those gradual declines, as opposed to corn being a little bit more, people says, more finicky. Just sharp decreases in yield as we were planting later. Soybean yields tended to decrease as planting was delayed. That was true in all sites. That was an interesting observation there, except for the Northeast location where waiting into early May was a better option. In terms of corn planting day trends, they were less consistent. We saw what we will not expect to see at the western location. Again, it's 1 year, and we need to understand better other factors, and that actually will lead me into the next slide, but also commenting here that more research we need to do. We have a long way to go still, multiple years. Taylor is on a PhD program. We want to capture more years, and we want to capture more sites for this project in a way that we are encompassing more environmental conditions, more varying conditions that can help us tease out some of these dynamics. And that leads me to some of our concluding thoughts. There are things that we also need to think about. It's not only about 250 bushel corn or 100 bushels soybean. There are other factors that come into the table that should inform or should be considered in the decision making. And some of the topics that we will see through all the day today. This is a plug to all of our upcoming speakers. We need to think about insect and disease dynamics based on planting dates. We saw that at the Worcester location, perhaps more of disease pressure when it was cold and wet. We need to understand details of the weather effects, why Western location didn't yield as good when we were planting corn early. There is opportunity there to tease out those dynamics. We will have Aaron this afternoon talking about weather as it relates to planting dates. We also need to consider fertility and weeds management. We saw in one of the pictures there are weeds that might pop up at some point, and there are weeds that we will be better off if planting earlier or later. As far as nutrients, certainly for corn, nitrogen management, if we are planting very early, we will have a smaller window of opportunity for putting those applications, ground preparation. If we have wet conditions, we might have a hard time getting out there for side dress. So those are considerations that we need to maintain. The next item here is commodity prices. If we might be increasing 50 bushels in corn and only 10 bushels in soybeans by planting early, but how that looks into the big picture at the crop enterprise level. So we need to look at the assess risk and manage risk from that perspective, not only about agronomics, but also economics. And another dimension of this project has been remote sensing tools. We will have a presentation from Luke later this morning about some of the applications that he has been tackling through this first year of research in this project, corn and soybeans, different sensors, different applications, different opportunities, and we are hoping to continue all of these efforts. A quick invitation, probably some of you are already familiar with our Ohio State Agronomy YouTube channel. There is a lot of content, agronomic content in that channel that you can visit. We have a playlist specifically for Battle for the Belt project, 33 videos in total where we discuss, those are 5 or 10 minutes long. We discuss different topics through all the growing season. A lot of those videos are collected in the field, and they are just coming live almost in a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So an invitation to join the channel. There are other ways that we have been distributing or raising awareness about this project. Social media is one. We periodically are posting things on Twitter, for example, now X. And we push articles, we push announcements. There is also our core newsletter. If you are not subscribed, there is a QR code on the bottom left of the slide. Core newsletter provides bi-weekly and weekly information about crops across the state. We try to address collectively different teams, tackle issues that might be concerning to farmers, to crop consultants, to industry representatives through all the season as well. And this is our acknowledgements. This is a big project. First, Taylor. Taylor has the boots in the ground. She's usually on a weekly basis out there. A lot of hard work, a lot of driving, a lot of hours dedicated into this project. This project we are tackling from a research and extension perspective altogether. That's why we had this survey at the beginning of this webinar. We want to address and assess what are better ways that we should be considering as far as conveying results, research results to our audience. We have research extension and meeting sponsors. They are listed here on the slide. We have USDA NIFA, the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Program out of University of Nebraska office. We have Ohio Soybean Council, we have Ohio Corn and Wheat, and we have support also from our college for this project. It takes a village. You see a lot of people here. You should be familiar with some of them. We have our farm managers at the 3 research stations. This is a lot of work. It's one project with 5 different planting dates. And if you think about corn, it's one project with multiple side dress dates. And so on and so forth. The list goes on and on. So thank you to our farm managers, students, staff that has been very fundamental to getting this work started. And this is just the beginning. And with that, I think we should have some time for questions, comments.